With that, our tale turns to other shores and to other people. Of Meleshem I wish to tell you, Pethenea of Belethene, greatest city of Valparaineia. Meleshem was a woman of great power, for she was the mistress of Belethene's main temple, devoted to all the benevolent divinities that the people of Valparaineia now revered in public temples for all to see, and whose impress they sought to harness for the furtherance of virtues, trusting that these would continue to protect them from the vices of the wrathful gods. These they no longer honored, though they continued to be worshipped in small circles under the cover of darkness. The secrecy of these cults did little to tarnish their renown, and they were delicately spoken of as those who feast at night. Be that as it may, it is not all to Meleshem's power, for she had also been married to the heir of a Bachai family who had since died, bestowing her with the inheritance of a seat in the council of Belethene. And so, in the days of her prime, she would be seen in many places, wearing the necklace and bracelets of a Pethenea and an Abishum, the helmet of the Samay nobility of old. With firm voice she spoke, and when she had spoken, things were seldom the same. And is it not appropriate that a war begun over a word would be decided by yet another word? Or rather, as they recall in memory, by the two speeches of Meleshem. But let us return to our tale and follow her in the days shaken by the bad news that returned with the envoys from Atea. In the months thereafter, many fears were brought to the temples and the council, voiced by many traders worried for their business, but also, in moments of discretion, by the strong and powerful who feared the ill will of the Bachai. Meleshem listened with sorrow, but ever thinking searchingly until a scheme began to form. But it was not until the following year that her plans saw the light of day, for at that time the people of Valparaineia gathered in Belethene to celebrate a great Imerithia. Now, as I told you, the Samese had been invited to the Petheia by the Bachai of Valparaineia, and this honor they had repaid by opening the Terabal to their newfound allies, and these customs were soon interwoven to give birth to a new ritual, the Imerithia. During the Imerithia, the myths of both cultures were relived in public temples open for all to see, so that the powerful families of a city, rather than inquiring into their fate in secrecy, demonstrated their good fortune and piety for all to see, and what the Pethenesi read in their fates would be enacted in stories and great works of art, honors that had prior been reserved for the great voyages of the Samese. Each of these spectacles rivaled the others, and they served to legitimate the great families as first among the people before the gods, as holders of the great Pelaisi, and those aspiring to great influence often sought to attain it through an Imerithia. As the Pethenea of Belethene's main temple, Meleshem now had a hand in these, so it is all but surprising that she waited for the time of a great Imerithia, when her authority would be at its greatest. As the Imerithia came, Meleshem left her palace ere the sun had risen, cloaked in ritual garments and followed by a procession of her disciples, to carry out the customs, beginning the day as guest in the house of the clan whose Pelai was chosen to glimpse into godly wills on behalf of the city, carrying the Pelai to the main temple to read it as she had read many before, instructing her followers what works of art to fashion, to give shape to her impressions, and once a week had passed, guiding the honorary clan to the city council, where the makings were displayed. Here the leaders of the great cities of Valparaineia had gathered, ready to consult and renew their bonds, and to finally step outside alongside their allies, to meet the cheering crowds and enjoy the glory and excitement of a celebrating city. No family of honor would miss this day, not even the Egantai, staunch rivals of Belethene for predominance in Valparaineia and defenders of the old customs. And it was here that Meleshem's plans went into motion with full force, with what became later known as her first speech. For after she had, in her role as Pethenea, made public the godly wills, it was time for the council members to speak and make known their concerns and ambitions. This ceremony was led by none other than the Pethenea, and Meleshem used this privilege to give the last word to herself, now as council member. And so she stood before the assembly, now wearing the Abishum as a sign of her worldly power, and she spoke. Honored families of Valparaineia, children of two great worlds of greatness, I meet you with joy, but it is under the shadow of bad omens that we come together. For the verdict of Amechele lies on our people now, and peril looms where once friendship bloomed. I speak to you as those who have not lost the courage to invite strangers. You have given a new home to the heirs of the great seafarers, and they devote their strength and wisdom to our great house now. But many of them come asking, and so I ask you, to where will we flee if they come to slay us again? The old home has fallen, sunken in madness, and in the north death awaits. There are no more lands. This is the edge of the world, and here we must make a home for our children. Despite everything I tell you, there is hope here, and there is strength. Amechele speaks of a people reborn, and I say, let this be us, not them. Let them have their rituals, we have ours. Let this be the beginning of a great voyage once again. Step outside with me and meet a new people, united by the bonds of the Emerithea. The assembly was struck by the gravity of our call, but none dared speak at first, for it would have upset the customs, as the council gathering was concluded, and it was time to embark on the procession. At last, Caletho, king of Egante, who had witnessed the verdict of Amechele but remained as the Samese had left, stepped out in disbelief and anger. And with rumbling voice he rose. What madness is this? Do you not know what calamity you provoke? I have fought with the Bachese in the north, and there is no match to their courage. Do not wake their wrath, I warn you. Not with me, I say, for I will not betray my bonds, but protect the gifts of my line. And he towered in front of her, trusting in the allegiance of the great clans of old, in the power of unspoken bonds with those who had not forgotten the old customs, who would not sever their bonds to the old home. But no aid came from them, for this Meleshem had foreseen. And she had gone to meet those who feast at night, in places unknown, and they had listened. And unknown too was their bargain, thus it is not known what price she paid, but at that very moment it was rewarded by a shattering silence to drown the fading rage of a king powerless. And in this silence Meleshem softly returned. The customs you claim to protect, dear friend? Then be reminded that it was not your time to speak, though you are our guest today, no obligation shall be laid upon you. He invited them to share in this oath of friendship with all of us, and meet our people if these things are still dear to you, or stay here if you will not be a part in this. And with that she opened the gates, and her call lingered, waiting for the decision of the awestruck leaders. One after another they stepped forward, first with hesitance, then with confidence, and triumphantly they were embraced by songs and screams. At last Caletho came, and with fierce gaze he passed the gates, and Meleshem knew there would be another price to pay one day. On this day, however, her words had forged the people's fate, a power unbroken, and the tale was carried into all lands quickly, of a second people united of the Emerisi. And ere a year had passed, the clans of Bachane convened again in Efera's halls. Some took the oath of the Emerisi with benign amusement, others were furious, and as they consulted, eager to preserve their unity, many fears and plans were brought up. Few would defend the Emerisi, not even Eferas, who had often cautioned reason in these days, for I see the warnings confirmed now. As foretold, we are surrounded by those hungry to take our place, as he said. Only the Darinai and Thilenai, whose riches were built upon trade with the Emerisi, sought to appease the stirring minds. Do you seek enemies in all directions? The Yovise are upon us, and the Ithilisi still face turmoil in the east. Do you want to risk war in the south? Lamented Ataferes. Not war we seek, but there can be no bonds with those who mock what is sacred, lest our presence in these lands be a mockery to all good things. These insults cannot go unanswered, countered Eferas. For days the deliberations went on, but ere it had been decided how to respond to the oath of the Emerisi, a discovery was made that brought sudden change. For one morning it was found that the Darinai and Thilenai had left Atea at night, racing back towards their cities, and none knew what words they would send to the Emerisi. And sensing treason, the Bachese quickly called upon their men, readying their forces to march swiftly. Thus began the war over a word, the Tarathemelas, as it was later called after an epic, begun by none other than Meleshem and completed by her disciples. Too many tales came to pass in these years to be recounted in great detail, and only the greatest are remembered to this day. It began with war at the shores, when the host of the Bachese arrived in Darinai. The Darinai had not expected a force at their doorstep so swiftly, but they would not surrender their cities, and they fought bravely to protect them, until at last their defenses were washed away by the ever-growing host of the Bachese. Their lands had not seen such bloodshed since the days of Artemai, since the time of deadly vengeance. The fall of Darine came as a heavy blow to the young Imerisei, and it caused great despair among them, as their anger turned against Meleshem. For a moment, her days of power seemed to fade, until news came from the Isle of Thylane. Ataferes had outrun his haunters, and he had made it safely back to his keep above the shores, though the relief was clouded by sorrow, for the fleet of the Darinai had fallen into enemies' hands, and now his isle was at risk of becoming a deadly trap. He called for help, and after painful hesitation, the sails were set. The Imerisei sailed into their first war, a swarm of painted hulls, dancing like sunlight over the waves. Their fleet was a remembrance to the sailing period. With finest craft it had been built, and it had been greatly strengthened by the Samaisi that had escaped the fall of their old home, by the survivors of the last great voyage of wood, metal, and stone. Thus met the two people, on rough seas as they had centuries ago, but this time only one would prevail, in the great battle for Thylane. Mighty were their fleets, and terrible their clash, as wood shattered and screams of death drowned in unforgiving waters. And costly was their victory, but as seafarers they were outmatched. The Imerisei had sailed into their first triumph, and Thylane was safe, a lonesome guard above a hostile world. But none dared step on the shores of Bachane, for the Bachai were gruesome enemies, and their strength was unbroken. Thus came years of bitter conflict as both lay waiting, saving their strength. Many smaller adventures came to pass during these days, as the Imerisei sought to rally allies around them, but few would answer their call. The Cleostinai had long fought against each other, and would not disrupt the hard-won peace, and none of the cities in Eulidine and Kabaline would risk upsetting their brothers, whose wrath they feared. And so the Imerisei stood alone, sheltered only by the vastness of the sea, and all eyes turned east to Ithilene. For both Meleshem and Eferas had their minds on the strength that slumbered across the sea, and it must have been around the same time that they each ventured out in secrecy to win the favor of the force to decide the war.